The sweetest rescue Bobcat returns nightly to sing with my cat and my soul at the piano. The first snow of the season fell over Aspen Ridge, Colorado, silent and complete. Arthur Bennett sat in his cabin at the forest's edge, 74 years old, hands resting on his knees. 9 months had passed since Grace died. 9 months since he'd last played piano, its polished surface now dulled with a fine layer of dust. He flexed his fingers. They trembled. Not the steady, controlled vibrato of a pianist's technique, but something he couldn't command or stop. He'd tried playing 2 weeks after the funeral. His left hand had stuttered through the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. Halfway through the second phrase, his fingers had simply frozen. The melody had scattered like dropped coins. He'd closed the lid and hadn't opened it since. The clock read 8:30. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work, erasing the edges of things. Suddenly the power went out. Complete darkness swallowed the cabin. He stood motionless, orienting himself by memory. Arthur moved slowly, hands extended, fingertips reading the familiar surfaces. The counter's edge, the door frame, the back of the armchair. Then his shin bumped the piano bench. He steadied himself, palms flat on the bench's worn leather. In the darkness, his fingers found the keys by instinct. A single note emerged, clear and unexpected. Before he could even think more, both hands were moving through the opening bars of Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat, the piece he and Grace had played together at their last recital. Her violin weaving above his piano. The rhythm wavered. He kept playing, the sound raw and honest in the dark cabin. Each wrong note a small confession. He didn't see the eyes at the window, twin points of reflected starlight, watching. When his hands finally stilled, Arthur sat in the darkness, breathing hard. Something had shifted, not healed, just cracked open slightly. The power returned an hour later, flooding the room with artificial light. Arthur blinked, disoriented. He looked at the piano as if seeing it for the first time in months. Then he closed the lid gently and went to bed. The next evening, Mittens appeared at dinner time. The cream tabby had been Grace's companion for 12 years, adopting them as much as they'd adopted her. She wound between Arthur's legs as he prepared his meal. Her purr, a small motor of contentment, when he sat down with his plate. She jumped onto the piano, her paws landed on the keys. A cascade of discordant notes rang out. Arthur laughed. The sound surprised him. It had been so long since he'd laughed that the muscles felt strange, unpracticed. Mittens looked at him, her green eyes wide, tail swishing. She stepped again, producing another jumbled chord. "All right," Arthur said. "All right, I hear you." He sat at the bench. Mittens settled on top of the piano, her favorite perch during Grace's practice sessions. Arthur began to. Something simple, a folk melody Grace had loved. His hands still shook, but less than yesterday. The notes came unevenly, but they came. Through the window, past his own reflection. The eyes appeared again. This time he saw them. Two luminous points in the darkness beyond the glass. Low to the ground. Animal eyes. Watching. Arthur's hands faltered. He stood slowly, approaching the window. The eyes didn't move. As his own eyes adjusted to the darkness and outside, he could make out a shape. Low, muscular, tufted ears, a bobcat. His heart quickened. The animal sat at the edge of the circle of light spilling from the window, just beyond the porch steps. It made no move toward the cabin, showed no sign of hunting or aggression. It simply watched, utterly still. Arthur backed away from the window, his pulse loud in his ears. Mittens remained on the piano, unconcerned. After a moment, Arthur returned to the bench. The bobcat hadn't moved. He placed his hands on the keys and continued the melody. The bobcat stayed until he finished. Then it turned and melted into the darkness. Arthur checked the locks that night. In the morning, he found tracks in the fresh snow. They led from the forest edge to the window and back again. The bobcat returned the next night, and the night after, always when Arthur played, always watching from the same spot beyond the window. On the fourth night, Arthur left the porch light off. The bobcat moved closer, to the bottom step. On the fifth night, It sat on the porch itself, just outside the door. Mittens had noticed by then. She would sit on the piano and watch the window while Arthur played, her ears forward, her tail twitching with interest rather than alarm. On the sixth night, Arthur opened the door a crack before sitting down to play, halfway through his practice. He heard a soft sound. He looked up. The bobcat stood in the doorway, backlit by starlight. It was a female, he could tell now, lean and winter rough. Her tawny coat was thick against the cold. She looked at him, at the piano, at Mittens, who gazed back with calm recognition. Then the bobcat walked into the cabin. Arthur's hands froze above the keys. The bobcat moved with liquid grace, her paws silent on the floor. She circled the piano once, sniffing. Mittens watched but didn't flee. The bobcat approached the domestic cat slowly. They touched noses, a brief contact, then separated. The bobcat made a low sound in her throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. Mittens answered with a soft chirp. Arthur exhaled slowly. "All right then," he said quietly. "I suppose you're a music lover too." He began to play again, watching both cats from the corner of his eye. The bobcat settled on the floor near the piano, her body relaxed but alert. Mittens returned to her perch on top. As Arthur moved through the piece, the bobcat made another sound, a low rumbling note that seemed to resonate with the bass keys. Mittens added her voice, a higher meow that punctuated the melody like a question mark. Arthur stopped playing and stared at them both. The cats looked back at him, waiting. He started again, and again they joined him, their voices untrained but somehow fitting, finding spaces in the music where their sounds belonged. It wasn't accompaniment in any formal sense. It was something else, a conversation, a presence. For the first time since Grace died, Arthur played through an entire piece without thinking about what he'd lost. He named the bobcat Ilse, after Grace's grandmother, who had fled Germany in 1938 with nothing but her violin and her courage. The name felt right for this wild thing that had chosen to enter his life unbidden. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Arthur would play each evening, and Ilse would arrive. Sometimes she stayed outside. Sometimes she entered. Always. She and Mittens would add their voices when Arthur sat at the piano, their sounds blending with the music in ways that shouldn't have worked but did. The bobcat's low rumbles often came during the bass passages. Mittens' sharper notes seemed to punctuate transitions, ends of phrases. Arthur began to listen for their contributions, leaving small silences where their voices could enter, but his hands continued to betray him. Some nights the trembling was worse. His left ear, damaged by an acoustic trauma 20 years earlier, had been declining for months. High frequencies disappeared first. Then the middle range began to blur. He could no longer hear the sustained pedal's subtle effect, couldn't distinguish the clear attack of each note in rapid passages. His musical memory, once photographic, now had gaps. He would start a piece he'd played 1,000 times and suddenly forget what came next, his hands hovering uselessly over the keys. One evening in late January, Arthur sat at the piano and couldn't begin. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the edge of the bench to steady them. The simple act of lifting his fingers to the keys felt impossible. He stared at the music in front of him, Debussy's Clair de Lune, and couldn't remember how it started. The notes on the page might as well have been a foreign language. Ilse arrived at her usual time. She stood in the doorway, waiting. When Arthur didn't move, she entered and sat in her customary spot. Mittens jumped onto the piano. Both cats looked at him expectantly. "I can't," Arthur said aloud. His voice sounded hollow in the small cabin. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore." He stood and walked to the window, his back to the piano, behind him. He heard Ilse make a questioning sound. He didn't turn around. "It's not honest," he continued, speaking to the darkness outside. "Playing like this. My hands shake. I can't hear half of what I'm playing. I forget pieces I've known for 50 years. Every time I sit down, I'm reminded of what I used to be able to do, what I can't do anymore." He heard movement behind him. When he turned, Ilse was standing, her body tense. She made a sharp, insistent sound, not aggressive, urgent. "I'm not betraying you," Arthur said. "I'm just being realistic. There's no point in playing badly. Grace understood that. That's why we left the stage together. Ilsa turned and walked to the door. She looked back once, her eyes catching the lamplight. Then she left. Arthur closed the door behind her and locked it. For 7 days, he didn't play. For 7 days, Ilsa didn't return. Mittens prowled the cabin restlessly, sitting at the window each evening, waiting for the Bobcat's arrival. Arthur tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice. He read. He cooked elaborate meals for one. He organized his sheet music into boxes, thinking he might donate it to the community center. On the 8th night, he woke to a crash. He stumbled out of bed, heart hammering. The front door, which he'd been careful to lock, had burst inward. Ilsa stood in the entrance, snow dusting her coat. She made a loud, harsh sound, unlike any he had heard from her before. It was almost a yell, demanding and fierce. Arthur stood in his pajamas, blinking in confusion. "What are you doing?" Ilsa walked to the piano and placed one paw on the bench. She looked at him and made the sound again. Louder. Mittens appeared from the bedroom and added her own voice. A sharp, insistent meow. "You can't just break into someone's house," Arthur said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ilsa didn't move. She held his gaze, her yellow eyes unblinking. In that stare, Arthur saw something he recognized. Stubbornness. Refusal. The same look Grace had given him 20 years ago, when he'd suggested they stop making music altogether after his hearing damage. "You're not giving up," Grace had said then, her voice firm. "We're not giving up. We're just changing how we do this." Arthur walked slowly to the piano. His hands still shook. His hearing was still damaged. His memory was still unreliable. None of that had changed. But he sat down anyway. He didn't try for perfection. He didn't aim for the performances of his youth. He simply played, letting his hands find their way through a simple melody, accepting the tremor, working around the gaps in his hearing, letting the music be what it was now, rather than what it had been. Ilsa made her low rumbling sound almost immediately, fitting her voice into the spaces between notes. Mittens joined from her perch, her meows sharp and bright against the deeper tones. Together, the three of them created something Arthur had never heard before. Not a performance, not a practice, a conversation between three different kinds of beings, using sound as their common language. When he finished, Arthur found he was crying. Ilsa approached him slowly and pressed her head against his leg, a gesture of such trust and affection that he could barely breathe. He placed his hand gently on her back, feeling the wild strength beneath her fur. Mittens jumped down and rubbed against his other side. "Thank you," Arthur whispered. Ilsa didn't leave that night. When Arthur woke in the morning, she was curled up under the piano. Mittens nestled against her. He walked quietly to the kitchen and made coffee, watching the two cats sleep. Outside, the morning light turned the snow to gold. After that night, something fundamental shifted. Arthur began to play differently. He stopped trying to recreate his past abilities and started exploring what he could do now. He discovered that his trembling hands could create interesting rhythmic variations if he leaned into them rather than fighting them. His damaged hearing forced him to focus on the middle registers, which opened up new harmonic possibilities. His unreliable memory meant he often improvised when he forgot passages, leading to unexpected musical discoveries. And always, Ilsa and Mittens were there, adding their voices. Their contributions became more sophisticated over time. Though calling it sophistication wasn't quite right, they simply became more attuned to the music, their timing more precise, their choices of when to sound and when to listen more deliberate. Arthur began to think of them as true collaborators rather than audience members. One afternoon while cleaning out Grace's desk, Arthur found a leather notebook he'd never seen before. Grace's handwriting filled the pages, entries dated over the past 5 years. He sat down to read, his hands trembling for a different reason now. Most entries were mundane observations about daily life, but scattered throughout were passages about him, about his struggles with aging and diminishing ability. She'd noticed everything he'd tried to hide, his frustration when his hands wouldn't cooperate, his grief when he couldn't hear certain frequencies anymore, his shame at forgetting pieces that had once been second nature. But she'd written something else too, an entry dated 3 months before she died. I worry that after I'm gone, Arthur will stop playing altogether. He's always been harder on himself than necessary, always measuring himself against an impossible standard. I wish I could tell him that the music doesn't care about perfection. It just wants to exist. If I could leave him one gift, it would be this: find another soul that needs your sound as much as I did. Let the music lead you to each other. Don't let it end with me. Arthur closed the notebook and looked around the cabin. Mittens slept on the couch, through the window. He could see Ilsa in the yard, investigating something in the snow. The piano stood against the wall, patient and waiting. Grace had known. Somehow, she'd known. That evening, Henry Morrison arrived for his monthly lesson. The 12-year-old lived down the mountain with his mother and had been studying piano with Arthur for almost 2 years. Due to the disrupted schedule, because Arthur's health was not stable, he was a gangly kid, all elbows and enthusiasm. His talent raw but genuine. Henry stopped in the doorway when he saw Ilsa. "Is that a bobcat?" "Her name is Ilsa," Arthur said. "Don't make sudden movements. Let her approach you if she wants to." Henry stood very still. Ilsa regarded him for a long moment, then returned her attention to the window. Mittens jumped down from the piano to investigate the newcomer, rubbing against his legs and greeting. "She just lives here now?" Henry asked. "She comes and goes," Arthur said. "The door's never fully closed. She can leave whenever she wants." They began the lesson. Henry was working on a Bach invention, struggling with the independence of his hands. Arthur guided him through the difficult passages, demonstrating slowly when Henry got stuck. Mittens settled on top of the piano. Ilsa moved to her usual spot on the floor, halfway through the lesson, when Henry finally managed to play through the entire piece without stopping. Both cats made sounds simultaneously. Ilsa's low rumble and Mittens' chirping meow overlapped, creating a brief chord of approval. Henry stopped playing and stared at them. "Did they just sing, Bebum?" "They've been doing that," Arthur said. "I think they like Bach." "That's the coolest thing I've ever seen." Henry breathed. Arthur smiled. "Play it again. Watch Ilsa. See if you can tell when she's about to make a sound." Henry played through the invention again, glancing at the bobcat between phrases. Sure enough, Ilsa made her rumbling sound at the end of each section, a natural punctuation. Mittens added her voice during the transitions. When Henry finished, he sat back, shaking his head in amazement. "It's like they understand music." "Maybe they do," Arthur said. "Or maybe we're all just responding to the same things. Rhythm, pattern, emotion. Music isn't just for humans, you know?" "Can I bring my mom to hear this?" Henry asked. "She won't believe me if I just tell her." Arthur hesitated. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, a private space where he could fail and try again without witnesses. But he thought of Grace's notebook, her hope that music would lead him to others who needed it. "All right," he said, "next week." Over the following days, Arthur prepared, not by practicing more, but by letting go. He accepted that his performance would be imperfect, that his hands would shake and his hearing would fail him in places, that some passages would escape his memory. He chose pieces that felt true to this moment in his life, rather than trying to recreate past glories. When Henry arrived with his mother, Sarah Morrison, the following week, Arthur was ready, sort of. Sarah was a woman in her 40s, a hospital administrator with tired eyes and a careful smile. She shook Arthur's hand, then noticed Ilsa and froze. "That's a wild animal," she said. "That's Ilsa." Arthur replied. "She's harmless. She just likes music." They settled into the cabin's small seating area. Mittens jumped onto Sarah's lap immediately, purring. Ilsa remained by the piano, watchful but calm. Arthur sat at the bench, his hands already trembling. He'd planned to play something simple, something safe. Instead, he found himself starting the Schubert Impromptu, the piece he and Grace had played together, the piece he'd abandoned after her death. His hands shook through the opening bars. He missed notes. His damaged ear couldn't hear the full resonance of the chords. But he kept playing, and as he played, he heard Grace's violin weaving through the melody, a memory so vivid it was almost real. Ilsa began her rumbling accompaniment during the first transition. Mittens added her voice shortly after. the two cats creating a layer of sound beneath Arthur's piano that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Arthur let the music flow through and around the mistakes, accepting them as part of the performance rather than failures to be avoided. When he finished, the cabin was silent. Then Sarah Morrison started crying. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "That was just very beautiful. Not perfect, but beautiful." Arthur smiled. "Not perfect, but beautiful. Yes, that was exactly right." Over the next few months, the cabin became a different kind of space. Henry continued his lessons, sometimes bringing friends to witness the cat's musical participation. Arthur began playing more often, not because he was practicing for anything, but because the act of making music had become essential again. A daily conversation with Ilsa and Mittens, with the memory of Grace, with the part of himself that was still a mom and capable of creating beauty. He started composing again, too, something he hadn't done in decades. Small pieces at first, just fragments of melody, but they grew. He wrote a piece called Three Voices that incorporated natural spaces for Ilsa and Mittens to add their sounds. He taught it to Henry, who played it with the same joy Arthur felt when creating it. One morning, Arthur found an old photograph in one of Grace's albums. It showed their garden from several years ago, the roses in full bloom, the fence needing paint. But in the corner of the image, half hidden behind a bush, was a small shape. Two luminous points caught by the camera's flash, a bobcat kitten, watching their house. Arthur stared at the photograph for a long time. Ilsa had been listening to their music long before she'd revealed herself. Years, perhaps. She'd been part of their audience, their community, their world, and they'd never known. He showed the photograph to Henry during his next lesson. The boy studied it carefully. "So she's been coming here since she was a baby?" Henry asked. "It looks that way. And she just decided one day to come inside." Arthur thought about that. "I think maybe she was waiting for the right moment, when the music needed her as much as she needed it." One evening in April, as the snow finally retreated and the first green began to show in the forest, Arthur set up his old recording equipment. He positioned the microphone carefully, accounting for the cabin's acoustics, making sure it would capture not just the piano but the full space where the cats' voices would resonate. He played through his new composition, Three Voices, letting the recording run. Ilsa and Mittens performed their parts with the same natural timing they'd developed over months of playing together. When he listened back to the recording later, Arthur heard something remarkable. The three sounds, piano, bobcat rumble, and cat chirp, had created a kind of harmony that existed nowhere in traditional music theory. It was honest. It was strange. It was true. He made copies of the recording and gave them to Henry, to Sarah, to a few others in town who had expressed interest. He didn't think of it as a performance or a product, just documentation. Evidence that this unlikely collaboration had existed. Spring deepened into summer. Ilsa spent more time outside as the weather warmed, hunting and roaming her territory, but she always returned for the evening music. The cabin door stayed open. She came and went freely, exactly as Arthur had always intended. One warm evening in June, Henry arrived for his lesson and asked the question Arthur had been expecting. Will Ilsa always come back, or will she eventually go back to being wild? Arthur looked at the bobcat, who was grooming Mittens with patient swipes of her rough tongue. The domestic cat purred, utterly content. "I don't know," Arthur said honestly. "I hope she'll always feel welcome here. But she's wild. She needs to be free to choose. That's the deal we've always had. The door stays open." "Aren't you afraid she'll leave and never come back?" "Sometimes," Arthur admitted. "But being afraid of losing something isn't a good reason to trap it. Grace taught me that." Henry thought about this, his young face serious. "My dad left 2 years ago," he said quietly. "Mom says he needed to choose freedom. I still don't understand it." Arthur sat down beside the boy. "That's different. Your father had responsibilities he walked away from. Ilsa is a wild animal choosing to share her life with us. She doesn't owe us anything. Every moment she's here is a gift." "But it still hurts when someone leaves," Henry said. "Yes," Arthur agreed. "It does, even when you understand why." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Arthur stood and moved to the piano. "Come on," he said. "Let's play something. That's what we do with the hurt. Remember, we make something from it." Henry joined him at the piano. They played a duet Arthur had been teaching him, their four hands finding their way through the melody. Ilsa and Mittens added their voices at all the right moments, the four of them creating something that belonged only to this room, this moment, these particular beings finding each other in sound. As summer turned to autumn, Arthur noticed changes in his own playing. The tremor in his hands hadn't improved, but he'd learned to work with it. His hearing continued to decline, but he'd discovered he could feel low frequencies through the piano's body, a tactile sense he'd never developed when his ears worked perfectly. His memory still had gaps, but improvisation had become a strength rather than a last resort. He was becoming a different kind of musician, not better or worse than he'd been, just different, true to this stage of his life rather than clinging to a past that no longer existed. On a cool October evening, Arthur played through his entire repertoire, pieces from every phase of his life, the technical show pieces of his 20s, the lyrical works of his middle years, the chamber music he'd played with grace, and finally, his new compositions, the ones that included space for wild voices to join in. Ilse and Mittens were there for all of it, sometimes quiet, sometimes vocal, always present. When Arthur finished, well past midnight, he stood and bowed to them both, a small gesture, but it felt important, recognition between artists. Arthur woke before dawn on a December morning to find both cats sitting at the window, their silhouettes dark against the pale pre-dawn light. He made coffee and watched them, these two creatures who had become his companions, his collaborators, his anchor to the present moment. Mittens turned and chirped at him, her usual morning greeting. Ilsa remained focused on something outside, her ears forward, her body alert but not tense. Arthur moved closer and saw what held her attention: a deer at the forest edge, browsing on the few remaining shoots not buried under snow. "Still a hunter," Arthur said quietly, "even after all these months with us." But Ilsa didn't move. She simply watched, acknowledging her nature without acting on it. When the deer moved away, she turned from the window and approached Arthur, pressing against his leg in her version of a morning greeting. Later that day, Henry arrived with unexpected news. His school was organizing a winter concert, and he wanted to perform 3 voices for the audience. "I know I can't bring Ilsa and Mittens to school," Henry said quickly, seeing Arthur's expression, "but I could play the recording during my introduction. Let people hear what inspired the piece, then play it solo. Would that be okay?" Arthur thought about it. The idea of sharing their private music with a wider audience felt uncomfortable. This hadn't been created for performance. It had been created for survival, for healing, for connection. But then he remembered Grace's words, "Let the music lead you to another soul that needs your sound." "Yes," Arthur said, "you can share it." They spent the afternoon polishing Henry's performance. The boy had developed real skill over the past year, his technique improving alongside his musical understanding. But more than that, he'd learned to play with honesty, without hiding behind perfection. Arthur heard his own influence in that, the hard-won wisdom of an aging artist who'd learned to embrace limitation. As Henry practiced, Ilsa and Mittens took their usual positions. The Bobcat made her rumbling sounds during the bass passages. Mittens added her bright chirps at the transitions. Henry played with growing confidence, smiling each time the cats joined in. "I wish everyone could see this," Henry said when they finished. "Not just hear the recording, actually see you 3 making music together." "Some things are meant to be private," Arthur replied. "This is our conversation. Letting others hear an echo of it is enough." That evening after Henry left, Arthur sat at the piano without playing. He simply looked at the keys, thinking about the journey that had brought him here, the loss of Grace, the decline of his abilities, the despair that had nearly made him quit forever. And then Ilsa, breaking through his door, refusing to let him surrender. He thought about all the years he'd spent chasing perfection, measuring himself against impossible standards. All the performances where one wrong note had felt like catastrophe, All the anxiety about maintaining his reputation, his skill, his place in a competitive world, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was this two cats waiting for him to play. A cabin at the forest's edge, the simple act of making sound because it needed to exist, not because anyone was listening or judging or keeping score. Arthur placed his hands on the keys. They trembled. As they always did now, he began to play, something slow and gentle, a lullaby Grace used to hum while cooking dinner. Ilsa and Mittens joined him immediately, their voices finding spaces in the melody as naturally as breathing. Outside, the winter darkness deepened. Inside, the music continued, passed between species, connecting past and present, bridging the distance between what had been lost and what remained. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, honest, alive. And in that small cabin where an old pianist had learned to play again, the conversation between three unlikely souls went on, each note a small act of courage, each sound a reminder that art doesn't end when ability fades. It simply transforms, finding new shapes, new voices, new reasons to exist. The door remained open. The music played on, and Arthur Bennett, 74 years old, hands shaking, hearing fading, discovered that he'd never played better in his life. The first snow fell in November, completing the circle of seasons. Arthur sat at the piano, watching the white flakes drift past the window, remembering the night a year ago when he'd played in the darkness and Ilsa's eyes had first appeared. So much had changed, so much had stayed the same. His hands still shook, his hearing had worsened, his memory was less reliable than ever. But these limitations no longer defined him. They were simply the conditions under which he worked now, no more or less significant than the temperature of the room or the quality of the piano's tuning. He began to play, something improvised, letting his hands find their own way. Ilsa emerged from the bedroom where she'd been sleeping. Mittens jumped onto the piano. Together, they created sound. Three beings from different worlds finding common ground in rhythm and melody and the simple act of being present with each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and persistent, covering the world in white. Inside the cabin, the music continued, imperfect and honest, exactly as it needed to be. Arthur played until his hands grew tired. Then he stopped, letting the final note fade into silence. Ilsa stretched and made her low rumbling sound one more time. Mittens meowed softly. Arthur placed one hand on the domestic cat's head, then reached down to rest his other hand on the bobcat's back. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Ilsa looked up at him with her wild yellow eyes. In them, Arthur saw understanding, not human understanding, but something equally valid, a recognition between beings who had chosen to share their lives, however improbably, bound together by something that transcended language. The cabin door stood open, as it had for months now, a rectangle of darkness beyond the lamplight, an invitation and an exit all at once. Ilsa could leave any time she wanted, return to the forest and her wildlife. But for now, she stayed. For now, the music continued. And in the small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest, three souls who should never have found each other kept creating their wordless conversation, one imperfect note at a time. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.